Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. If you trust the mainstream media, well, then you're in the minority. Sadly, a great deal of media today is not designed to inform, but rather confirm political biases. This approach to the news is not only polarizing, but it's also lowering journalistic standards. Is this why readers and viewers seek their news elsewhere? Cross-talking the news, I'm joined by my guest, Charles Ortel in New York. He is a private investor and a writer, as well as host of the podcast show Sunday with Charles. And in Williamsburg, we cross to Andrew Langer. He is president of the Institute for Liberty, as well as the host of the Andrew Langer Show on WBAL in Baltimore. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Charles, let me go to you first. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this program is the scandal around Brian Ross over at ABC. And, of course, it was a horrific mistake. And the perception is there that wasn't very good journalism. And it's true, because he was getting ahead of himself. So much of the media gets ahead of itself, not in reporting information, but to further their agenda. And in the process, they're damaging journalism. The standards of journalism have dropped so badly in the Western world right now. And I would say, and we can talk about this later in the program, it's destroying institutions that we used to cherish. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I started out as an investment banker, and about 10 years ago, I began exposing corporate fraud and then charity fraud. And I took the scandal, which has still not been prosecuted, the Clinton Foundation scandal, to Brian Ross through one of his closest friends about 2 years ago, and he refused to cover it. I did the same thing with Jake Tapper and the same thing with Maggie Haberman at the New York Times. And what I think you have here is the established media needs to preserve access to the established political parties. So they're never going to take an assault as far as it needs to go into the truth.
You know, Andrew, that's so well put there, because there are so many things. You know, we had this unmasking after the election, but nobody ever talks about that. We have the Democrats. They did not allow access to the DNC server. We know that the Democrats and possibly the FBI was paying for this raunchy dossier. Nobody talks about that in the mainstream media. It's always pushed away because it doesn't further their agenda. And instead, they go after these myths, which I call a conspiracy without a crime. Of course, I'm talking about Russiagate. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, listen, there are a couple things that are going on here. One of the real problems I see is what we call the 24-second news cycle. Everybody is racing to be first with a story. They don't care particularly if the story is right, if the facts are accurate. They just want to be first to the headline because they make their money through whatever clickbait that they can get. And it's very difficult to hedge against this. And I think you're absolutely correct. There are certain standards of journalism that simply aren't being followed. Heck, I've gone down this road with journalists myself, journalists who are not following their sort of standard practices under journalistic ethics or what have you. With regards to these other stories, we have to remember, right, is that it's not just that journalists are like anybody else. But what we're finding more and more is that we have journalists who have no real intellectual curiosity.
Absolutely.
No real interest in sort of delving further, unless it's to pursue some sort of an agenda. You know, we were talking before about this Imran Awan story, which is this story of the IT director for some 80 Democratic House members who was downloading terabytes of data from the House computers, had access to the DNC computers. And yet there is one actual reporter and then a couple of other sort of writers who are writing on this story out of Washington, D.C. This is a massive scandal. And yet nobody is covering it because for agenda reasons or because they're just not curious about it.
You know, Charles, we already heard the word clickbait here, and I think that's very interesting. Is that, and this is what it's really gotten down to, is to get clicks, to get eyeballs, and worry about it later. I mean, we saw this during the last year's campaign, where journalists openly said, well, Trump is a very different kind of candidate, so we have to relax. That's my word, relax our journalistic rules. I mean, that is a very slippery path, okay? Either you have principles or you don't have principles. And what they're doing is that since we're going to treat him differently as a result, viewers and readers are now seeing mainstream media is not fulfilling those principles that they say that they uphold. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, what I've found in my experiences with journalists, and please don't take this the wrong way, but most journalists are excellent with words and hopeless when it comes to understanding numbers.
Very.
And what we have since 1998-99 is an economic realignment where unregulated globalism is growing to dominate, even trying to dominate large markets like the United States, Europe, et cetera. And the proponents of this unregulated globalism are Republicans and Democrats, and even non-aligned people around the world. Why? Because in this gigantic unregulated global market, you can make a lot of money trading influence from, for various ways. And so people are doing it on the campuses, they're doing it in investment funds, they're doing it in the banks, they're doing it in the global media complexes. To understand this, you have to understand basic economics and financial statements, and you have to know how to follow the money. And these journalists don't know how to do that.
And I think that's an excellent point. Andrew, you said, what I think we've seen over the last 20, 25 years is that the mainstream media is just the PR for the establishment. It's not news. I mean, because of the nature of my job, I have to watch MSNBC. I have to watch CNN. It's, sometimes I need a bucket, but, I have to do it. And I don't learn anything. I mean, I don't get my news from them. I have my own sources. I put 5 or 6 hours every single day, 7 days a week, in learning about news from people that I trust and places that I can go that I can trust. Okay, but that I don't, because all I see is just advocacy for the establishment, for a liberal ideology, for globalism, as Charles has mentioned here, and I think that's intentional right now. Okay, I mean, this is they're channeling all of this to keep this narrative about the status quo. And we do know, if we look at the last election, the two different parties, we had an insurgency with the Democrats, we had an successful insurgent with Trump and the Republicans. I think the establishment is terrified, and this is why the media needs to get things back. And that's why they're moving towards censorship. And we'll get to that in the second part of the program. All of these things come together. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, that's exactly right. They do flow one into the other. You have these issues where things sort of step over the line into advocacy, and some of it has to do with not wanting to damage the existing relationships that are out there.
Right.
Maggie Haberman, who went to the same, actually, true story, Maggie Haberman went to the same high school as me. You want to talk about duplicitousness. We were supposed to appear on a panel together talking to high school students, and she had the gall to say because she was a journalist, she wasn't going to appear on a panel with me because I'm in the advocacy world, when in fact the bulk of her so-called reporting is done from an advocacy basis. I mean, I was sort of floored by this. And I said, okay, all the more reason for her and I to appear on a panel. No, she wouldn't do it. So, I've been there.
Charles, I think that's a really great story here, because that's what I come across all of the time, is that, it's not news. It is how to deflect from your narrative, protect your narrative, and the people that are protecting you, okay? I mean, I'm not on television because of my pretty face, okay? I'm on television for a very different reason. When I look at the cable stations, I think that it's more, they can read the teleprompter probably better than I can, because I'm awful at it even after all these years. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, it's advocacy, and at least, MSNBC is open about it, and I respect that, and Fox is open about it, and I respect that. But everybody else, they like to pretend that they're journalists. They're not. I mean, it's claptrap, really, what they're going after. Go ahead, Charles.
And Peter,
let me go to Charles here. Go ahead.
One thing I would say is that where I get my news, in addition to your channel and other places, one of the best sources for news I like is ZeroHedge.com, and that's an independent channel for news that does a really good job of getting out ahead of the curve, not only with analysis, but providing you access to source documents. Another one is FreeRepublic.com. Both do the same thing. You have to check and check these facts, double check, and engage your mind.
Charles, I think
why wait around?
You're absolutely right. Zero Hedge, because going back to something you said earlier, they like numbers. They understand the economy, and I really like the marriage of news and economic news that they have. That's very well done. Okay, Andrew, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, you talk about this relationship between the establishment and journalism, and nowhere is it more clear than the one thing that nobody seems to be talking about in this whole Michael Flynn mess, which is this issue of, we know that the FBI was listening in the conversation between Flynn and Ambassador Kislyak. We know that they trapped Flynn with it later on. What we don't know is how and why the Washington Post got their hands on that transcript, except this relationship between the establishment, the deep state, and the so-called mainstream journalism.
Charles, I find we're going to have 1 minute before we go to the break here. Everyone likes to use this word collusion, and technically in a legal sense it's not illegal. But all the collusion I see is with the FBI, with the media, and a lot of of course, the Democratic Party and its establishment. That seems to be a collusion. I mean, we could use the word cabal or something like that, but they're in lockstep all of the time. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I think it goes all the way back. It could go as far back as 1989. It's a collusion, a cooperation between establishment wings of the Democrat and Republican Party to promote the interests of the big defense contractors, big global medias, big global banks, et cetera, to obstruct the analysis and the finding of the real truths that need to be addressed. It's a gigantic, long-term, many decades long, I would argue, conspiracy.
Well, it's certainly been corrosive. All right, gentlemen, we're all going to go to a break here, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the news industry. Stay with RT.
When lawmakers manufacture consent instead of public wealth. When the ruling classes protect only themselves. When the financial merry-go-round lifts only the 1% up. It's time to ignore middle-of-the-road signals. Going underground, bringing real news to Britain and the world.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Baldwin. Gosh, I look fantastic. Hollywood guy.
Usual Suspects, my favorite movie.
Proud American. First of all, I'm dressed as George Washington. Sure. An RV enthusiast. This is my buddy Max, famous financial guru, and well, he's a little bit different.
I'm Honest Abe. You're Abraham Lincoln.
Oh my God, they're rolling their windows up.
With all the drama happening in our great country, I'm hitting the road to have some fun, meet everyday Americans, to hopefully start to bridge the gap. This is the Great American Pilgrimage.
Great American
Afghanistan is not a good place. It's not a good country. And چون کسی که به شهرت میرسه خیلی برش خطرناک است برای افغانستان. قبل از اینکه در شهرت برسد دوستا در فیسبوک، دوستای مکتب، در کوچه، همسایه‌ها، حتی قوم خویش برش میگفت که تو هم شکل بروسلی است. فامیلیم کس برادرایم به اسم عباس صدا میکنن و مردم افغانستان وقتی بیرون میرم بروسلی افغانستان صدا میکنن. و این عباس علی که خود به بروسلی به اصطلاح عرضه کرده و در جهان فعلا به اصطلاح مشهور است و را تایید نمیکنه دین، این مردود است، قبول نیست و اسلام رد میکنه هر آن عملی که و همیشه تمرین کنه چون اتفاق نمیکنه او این مسلمان است یا او نبود اتفاق نمیکنه.
یک چیزی شده که مثال یک نفری به شبیه بروسلی برآمده، یاد بروسلی زنده میکنه، باعث از این میشه که دوباره بروسلی در عرصه سینما برگرده یا در ورزش. بسیاری خوب است برای رشد ورزش.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the news industry. Okay, I'd like to introduce now for the program Mark Crispin Miller. He in New York. He is a professor of media and culture and communication at New York University, as well as author of the book Fooled Again: The Real Case for Electoral Reform. Okay, Mark, I understand you were listening to a part of the first part of the program, and you already have a reaction. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I find the conversation that I was able to hear really fascinating, and I agree with pretty much all of it. I would simply comment that it does have a slightly amnesiac quality. I mean, I was pleased to hear, I think it was Charles, trace this collusion that we're talking about back to 1989. I think, you know, to be perfectly honest, what we're talking about here really dates back at least to November 22nd, 1963. I mean, it was with the Kennedy assassination that the press jumped wholeheartedly into the position of ferocious advocate for the official narrative of that historic, history-changing incident. Which they continue, you know, to promote to this day. I mean, recently it was back in the news because of the delayed and partial release of a number of documents by the CIA and FBI. They were supposed to have released them a while ago due to a law that was passed in the early 90s after the release of Oliver Stone's film. I think President Obama gave them a pass, let them not release them. We don't need to get into the weeds on this. The fact is, it was back in the news. Now, we're talking about an official story that some 4/5 of the American people no longer believe, you know? And something like 60% of the American people now believe that the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination. 19% think that Lee Harvey Oswald did it, okay? Despite that overwhelming majority, to this day, the New York Times and CNN and NPR and the New Yorker and all the rest of them continue to flog that very dead horse of the Warren Report.
Yeah, but
that's
Mark,
kind of staggering.
but Mark, you know, let me go to Andrew on this here. I mean, I think that's a good starting point there. But then we have the Pentagon Papers. We had what happened in Watergate, and there was actually a few moments of glory for journalism, I would say there. And then it's all downhill. The illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then there's no prosecutions for what happened in the great financial crisis of 2008, and it just goes on and on. The difference is the technology changes, and I think this is why the elites are really they're turning to censorship. Absolutely, they want to pull this back in. They want their monopoly back. They want their monopoly back for exactly the reasons that Mark pointed out to us. And I think this is a very interesting, very dangerous time because these people have a lot of power, and they don't like people like me and where I work. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, and let me add to this, right? Because normally what you would have is you would have independent organizations that would be going out there and verifying and acting as a check on whatever malicious, fraudulent stories are out there. Now we have this very nebulous definition of fraud, and attorneys general all around the country, Eric Schneiderman in New York, Kamala Harris in California, who are using very weird, vague definitions of fraud to go after these nonprofit organizations and go to the heart of what they're doing. It's part of why folks are going after what they call dark money from these organizations, and trying to get at who's funding them, because they can't attack the veracity of what folks are saying. So what they're going to do is they're going to try to say what they're saying is fraudulent and then try to shut them down. I mean, that's Operation Choke Point was something the government did. That was the pretext, was to go after fraud. You had, as I said, Eric Schneiderman in New York going after organizations engaging in advocacy, saying they were engaging in fraudulent behavior. And so that's the next sort of tactic in all this.
You know, but it's interesting, Charles. I mean, I think it's really interesting what Andrew just said there. But is anybody going to really seriously take a look at the Podesta brothers? I mean, we want to look at, at fraud. Okay, why don't you go to the center of it? Okay, I mean, again, it's just silence. It's just silence all the time. You hear the crickets in the background here. I mean, if we want to go back to all of the events since the election, there is so much illegality going on. The leaking, the unmasking, all of this. There's no interest in it whatsoever in the mainstream media. If you watch CNN and MSNBC, it's not it didn't even happen. I mean, that's how dangerous things are. And then they talk about things, they talk about myths and unicorns. That's what I call Russiagate. Go ahead, Charles.
Well, the largest unprosecuted fraud in history is going on right now. That's the Clinton Foundation, the Obama Foundation, creating these fake foundations that aren't audited, where billions of dollars is sent towards these foundations but not accounted for, where they're engaged in partisan activities, where they're enriching the Clinton family, the Obama family. And all of that is supported, in the case of the Clinton Foundation, by the Ivy League, by the big universities, the endowed universities, who, if the Trump administration wanted to do this, could be put out of business. I mean, you could go to a Harvard, which has supported the Clinton Foundation, and say, listen, you're engaged in illegal enormement. You're donating to a charity that doesn't exist. We want to shut you down. You're a for-profit corporation. Technically, you could do that if you wanted to.
Mark, it's really interesting. I mean, I forgot one interesting element in all of this. I used to be an academic, and I was basically hounded out because I just can't accept political correctness, because accepting political correctness gets in the way of doing real science and real scholarship, okay? Because they want you to have blinders, okay? That's not scholarship, okay? And this is the role of the academy, of universities. I mean, brainwashing youth. I mean, it's amazing to pay so much money to learn junk, because that's essentially what young people learn. Millennials learn junk at a very high price tag. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, what we're talking about is a moment at which both the media and the universities have really kind of started tightening the gag in a way. This is a very, very dangerous moment, and I want us to, focus directly on the issue you raised a moment ago in your question, which is the, tightening censorship that we see going on all around us. It is successful in large part because for decades, both the media and the academy, and you could include high schools as well.
Sure.
The education establishment and the media establishment have both long refused to acquaint Americans, to teach Americans, to let Americans think about and know about the dark side of American history. Most Americans are unaware of the real record of the CIA and the FBI, for example. And then there's the holdover of all the years of intense anti-communism, that created a kind of sediment in the mass mind on which now the press has successfully built this sort of demonic vision of contemporary Russia, which is exceedingly dangerous. Now, what I find really unprecedented in my many years of observing all this is that now we see a really zealous push across the board to shut down free expression of many, many points of view. And we see it with Google changing its algorithms. Facebook is now, basically limiting the number of notifications one can get. We see the same thing happening with Twitter and YouTube. We see legislation being passed or considered that will outlaw Russian propaganda, whatever that is, that's not defined. We see the criticism of Israel and or Zionism now labeled a kind of hate crime, and laws are being passed to outlaw that. Then there are inexplicit means whereby discussion of other inconvenient subjects is as good as illegalized. I mean, for example, vaccines. You cannot question the official verdict on vaccines, i.e. that they're all safe, they're all necessary. There's no problem with any of them. The same with Pizzagate. You mentioned the Podesta brothers. It's practically an arrestable offense even to bring that subject up, okay? Now, on top of this, we have what you call political correctness. There's this kind of bizarre, fanatical devotion to identity politics. It's fanatical identity politics that also makes certain questions, certain subjects, practically grounds for,
no, Mark,
academic
I think
dismissal,
it's already gone to the extreme. It's about pronouns now, okay? I'm afraid to go to Canada and California.
Well,
I might use the wrong pronoun here. Andrew, let me go to you. We're rapidly running out of time. This whole mindset, this cabal, if you want to call it that, I mean, they're destroying institutions. They're destroying principles. All right, and this is what I find really, really worrying, because this political correctness, this gagging, the control of the mainstream media, they're not satisfying people's problems. They're not thinking about their problems. Okay, a better future for their children, a better job. They all want to talk about transgender toilets. That's not going to fix the country. Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, listen, I just want to say this. You know, as someone who is an ardent anti-communist, who believes that Oswald acted alone, who believes in vaccinations, who believes, I just want to say, I believe that you know, censorship is a massive, massive problem, and any sort of attempts to censor speech is a massive, massive problem. Just want to say, so to differentiate myself with Mark, but to make it really clear that there is that point of agreement. You know, that being said, right, we you know, anything that serves to divide us and divide us as a people makes it easier for people to be controlled.
Absolutely.
If you set people against one another, it's much, much easier for people to control them.
Okay, Charles, I'm going to give you the last 40 seconds on the program. I really like what Andrew had to say there, because this divide and conquer, it's a very, very risky strategy, because the people that are divided can't even talk to each other anymore. That's the kind of environment that we live in. That's very, very dangerous. Go ahead, Charles, last word.
Well, I think I'd like to close with some good news, and that is the horse long ago left the barn. The horse long ago left the barn. There are now millions of independent thinkers and journalists, courtesy of the internet. There's a lot of information to engage your mind around. And the price point for these establishment colleges is out of control high. So the global media is under assault. The established universities, I think, are under threat. And free minds around the world are engaging and collaborating, and I think we're getting closer to the truth, not farther away.
I like it. We end on a good note. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests in New York and in Williamsburg. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.